Evening. I'm Bradley Graham, co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And on behalf of the entire staff, I'd like to welcome you. It's really quite a thrill to have Rick Atkinson here this evening to talk about Book 3 of his monumental Liberation Trilogy. The Guns at Last Light was only just released, but the early reviews of this concluding volume have already hailed the book as nothing less than magnificent. Even other historians who themselves have written about World War II are positively gushing over what Rick has done. His gripping narrative, sublime prose, the masterful weaving of big assessments with a multitude of details perfectly placed. As Max Hastings raved in the Wall Street Journal the other day, this is as good as military history gets. At the end of the book, Rick sums up the advantages in organization, manpower, and resources that helped the United States and allies crush Germany. Warfare like yours is easy, Rick quotes a German prisoner complaining. But of course, as Rick writes, there was nothing easy about waging the war in Europe. The same might be said of Rick's own 3-volume, 14-year effort. He has made it look easy, or at least every time I saw him over the last decade and a half, he seemed to have the project well in hand. And of course, there was nothing easy about it. But like the United States going up against Germany, Rick has had certain advantages tackling the biggest war story ever. His great discipline, a tremendous sense of organization, including a penchant for very detailed chapter outlines and personal timetables to keep himself on track, a zest for combing through archives and gathering mega numbers of facts, a terrific ability to synthesize, and a superbly elegant writing style. Rick and I have known each other for more than 20 years, and although he has spent much of his working life chronicling wars and warriors, he's never seemed to me to tire of the subject. We ran into each other a few years ago while both of us were on vacation in the Virgin Islands, and Rick was all read up on the Caribbean Wars and ready to talk about battles going as far back as how the native islanders chased away Christopher Columbus and the Spaniards in the 1490s. I just wanted to play tennis and snorkel. On top of everything, Rick is really a very nice guy. And here at P&P, we have a particularly soft spot for him. He's a regular in the store, and in fact, last year, authored a lovely brief history of P&P for a collection of profiles titled My Bookstore. We expected that a lot of people would be here this evening, and I did offer to host Rick in a larger venue, but he said he wanted to speak in the store, which has special significance to him. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Rick Atkinson.
Thank you for that, Brad. And thanks so much for coming tonight. This is fantastic. I've had the great privilege to have written 6 books, and each of those 6 books opened on publication date in this, my neighborhood bookstore. It's an important place to me, as it is to many of you. It's a safe haven. It's a little island of civility. And I think what Brad and Lissa are doing here is fabulous. I've got friends, neighbors, family here. My wife Jane is here. My son Rush is over there. There's a good contingent from the Turtle Park Sunday morning softball game. Warning track power since 1972. So thank you all for coming tonight. And I look forward to hearing from you after I talk for a few minutes. So Jack London said that a writer ought not wait for inspiration to come knocking on the door, but instead should light out after it with a club. And 15 years ago, I took my club, and what I found, what inspired me, was the Second World War. The war lasted 2,174 days, and by the end of it, it was the greatest catastrophe in human history. 60 million dead. That's 27,000 dead every day for 6 years. It's 1,150 dead an hour. If you were a German boy born between 1915 and 1924, the odds were 1 in 3 that by 1945 you would be dead. Of 190 million Soviet citizens, 14% of them lost their lives during the war. 60 million dead in 6 years means a death every 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. That's World War II. The writer Kingsley Amis once said he only wanted to read books that began, "A shot rang out." Here you go. My focus in writing a trilogy about World War II has been the role of the Western Allies in the liberation of Europe, and many, many shots ring out. The story is really a triptych. It's 3 panels that can be appreciated independently, but actually fit together. I've crafted the Liberation Trilogy as a triptych. The first panel or volume begins with the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, and we follow the Anglo-American armies across North Africa in fighting in Morocco, Algeria, and finally in Tunisia. The second volume, The Day of Battle, follows those armies north across the Mediterranean to the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, and then the invasion of southern Italy in September 1943, and on through places like Salerno, the Rapido River, the Volturno River, Anzio, Cassino, San Pietro, and ultimately to Rome, which falls on June 4th, 1944. This final volume opens on May 15th, 1944, at St. Paul's School on Hammersmith Road in London, where Eisenhower, Churchill, Patton, Bradley, King George VI, and several dozen of the most senior commanders who are about to launch the invasion of Europe gather to go over the plan for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, a last time. They meet in an auditorium that's known as the Model Room at St. Paul's, and they were sitting on hard wooden benches that had normally been occupied by schoolboys. The poet John Milton, among other English luminaries, went to St. Paul's. It was cold as a meat locker in the model room, and many of the generals were bundled up, even though it was the middle of May, in their overcoats. And on the floor in the cockpit of the auditorium was an immense plaster relief map showing that part of France where the River Seine empties into the Atlantic at a scale of 6 inches to the mile. And as the plan was reviewed, a British brigadier in non-skid socks shuffled around on this map with a pointer, and as they reviewed what was going to happen on what would become the most famous battlefield in the world 3 weeks later, he used his pointer to point at things like the beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, and some of the towns that were going to become famous within 3 weeks, like Saint-Lô, Cherbourg, Cannes, and over there, Paris. Then for the next 12 chapters, the action unspools at these places and others: Mortain, Falaise, Paris, the Hürtgen forests, Antwerp, Nijmegen, and on through the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, the encirclement of the Ruhr, and finally the final drive across the Elbe River to VE Day, Victory Europe, on May 8, 1945. And as in the first 2 volumes, we periodically shift from a foxhole tactical view of what's happening on high to operational and strategic perspectives. Most of chapter 10, for example, is set on Malta and at Yalta, with Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin and their senior military brain trusts. And we often take a peek on the other side of the hill to see what the Germans are doing. I also recount at some length the invasion of southern France on August 15th, 1944, which is something that most Americans know very little about, and it's an important part of the liberation of Europe. A Franco-American force landed in southern France. They drove up the Rhone River Valley. They essentially turned right at Lyon. They went through the Vosges Mountains in the winter, very brutal fighting, and they ultimately captured Strasbourg in November 1944, and they're on the Rhine 4 months before any other Western allies reach the river. And the characters are fantastic, and they include the American generals Jacob Devers and Alexander Patch, for example, and the French First Army commander Jean Delat de Tassigny, who is beyond the capability of any novelist to invent. One admirer called Delat an animal of action, and he would appear in bivouacs in the middle of the night where his soldiers were sleeping, and he would roar, "What have you done for France?" Well, as you may suspect, the liberation of Europe is not an undiscovered subject. Amazon.com, if you'll pardon the expression, lists 60,000 hardcover titles about World War II. So how do you tell that story so that you and you and you hear it anew, as if for the first time? Well, part of that is voice, of course, and narrative coherence, but a good part of it must be archival spadework. And when it comes to World War II, an archive rat like me can live large. The U.S. Army records alone for World War II weigh 17,000 tons. Like all great events in American history, World War II is bottomless. There is more to discover. There will always be more to discover. So, for example, something I found at the National Archives in College Park. If you're thinking about invading France, and if you know that a seaborne assault is going to be difficult because the Germans are going to defend the beaches with everything they've got, and if you know that an airborne assault with paratroopers or gliders is going to be very hazardous, what are your alternatives? How about digging a tunnel under the English Channel? And in fact, I found the document, the study that was done, in which it was reported to the High Command, yes, sir, we can do this. It'll take 15,000 soldiers, miners, a year to excavate 50,000 tons of spoil, but yes, sir, we can do this. But what they couldn't figure out was what happened when that first soldier popped his head out of the hole and the entire German 7th Army was waiting for him. There was a whole set of problems about the invasion of Normandy, and it had its own acronym, PINWE, Problems of the Invasion of Northwest Europe. There was anxiety that the Germans would drop rats infected with bubonic plague on London, and there were bounties offered on carcasses to test for bubonic plague. There was anxiety that the Germans would drop what were called radioactive agents all over England, and there were Geiger counters hidden all over to test for these agents. The Allies also stockpiled 160,000 tons of chemical munitions in England and in the Mediterranean. And I found in the National Archives the 2 battle plans for chemical war in Normandy. There were 2 plans. One plan was if we cared about French casualties. The other plan, not so much. It would have been devastating. If chemical warfare had broken out in Normandy, there would have been thousands, if not tens of thousands, of French civilian casualties. U.S. Army draftee standards progressively were lowered during the war to allow the induction of what were known as physically imperfect men. So at the beginning of the war, to be drafted, you had to have 12 of your natural 32 teeth. By 1944, how many teeth did you have to be drafted? Zero. And that's because the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy drafted 1/3 of all the dentists in this country. And they drafted them so that they could extract 15 million teeth, they could fill 68 million more, and they could make 2.5 million sets of dentures, all so that GIs who had been inducted into the Army could masticate the Army ration. I know that sounds like an obscene act, but that was the standard. In 1944, a man could be drafted if he had 20/400 vision, if it was correctable to 20/40 in one eye. The armed forces made 2.3 million pairs of eyeglasses, and the old bromide came true that the Army didn't really examine eyes, it just counted them. In fact, you could be drafted if you had only one eye, or if you were completely deaf in one ear, or if you had lost both external ears, or if you were missing the thumb and 3 fingers on a hand, including your trigger finger. Venereal disease had kept men out of uniform for a good part of the early years of the war, but that restriction was lifted, and soon the Army was drafting 12,000 VD patients a month, most of them syphilitic. How could they do that? Penicillin. The extraordinary discovery by British scientists of the antibiotic agent in the 1920s was followed by a massive effort by the Americans and the British to take a substance that had been made by the gram and to make it by the kilo and eventually by the ton. Why these extreme measures to fill the ranks? Because of the crying need for soldiers, especially infantrymen and especially riflemen. Even in a country of 130 million, we were running out. The Brits did run out. The war remained brutal and voracious to the very end. In April 1945, the last full month of the war in Europe, there were more than 10,000 American soldiers killed in Germany. More than 10,000. That's almost as many as had died in June 1944, the year of invasion. It was awful virtually to the last gunshot. So desperate was the American Army for infantrymen that the High Command took an action that had been unthinkable just a few months earlier. They allowed black soldiers to volunteer for white combat units. 53 platoons of colored infantry were integrated into 11 otherwise white divisions. Many of those African American soldiers surrendered sergeant stripes they had earned as cooks or truck drivers or laborers for the privilege of fighting as privates. There are many other surprises and discoveries. I found a detailed account written by the funeral home director in Atlanta who had been summoned to prepare Franklin Roosevelt's body after he died at Warm Springs, Georgia on April 12, 1945. The document is as powerful and moving as it is clinical. After several hours of injecting 6 bottles of embalming fluid into the dead president and otherwise preparing him for eternity, this mortician summoned Arthur Prettyman, who was the president's valet, and had him comb Roosevelt's hair just so. I tell the story of one of the most secret weapons of the war, something called a posite fuse. That was the code name. And it was an extraordinary invention and industrial manufacturing of a tiny miniaturized radar sensor which could be put into the nose of an artillery shell, basically a nose the size of an ice cream cone, so that that radar sensor could detect when the target you wanted to destroy was close enough to trip a sensor to make the shell explode. It was an astonishing feat of engineering. And the first posit fuses were used in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans called it pure manslaughter. John Updike once said that World War II was the 20th century's central myth. He called it a tale of Troy, whose angles are infinite and whose central figures never fail to amaze us with their size, their theatricality, their sweep. Theatrical they are. I believe the narrative historian's true calling is to bring back the dead. And I try to do just that, not just with outsized figures you've heard of, but others who are less familiar, like Generals Ted Roosevelt Jr., who's been with me through all 3 volumes, and Lucian Truscott Jr., also with me through all 3 volumes. Even amid the clash of army groups, my eye is always drawn to the small particular tragedy that illuminates the larger catastrophe. For example, the death of General Sandy Patch's son, Mac, who was a young infantry captain under his father's command in the U.S. 7th Army in southern France. And I tell that story using the general's letters to his wife, Julia. Those letters are in the archive at West Point. And it's unspeakably heartbreaking. General Patch writes to Julia about her dead son. I cannot and must not allow myself to dwell upon our irreparable loss. It's their only child. As I write, the tears are falling from my eyes. Providence decrees, and we must obey. Providence decrees, and we must obey. I tell the story of the suicide of Rear Admiral Don P. Moon, who had commanded the naval forces at Utah Beach at Normandy, and shortly before the invasion of southern France, where he was also to have a large role, blew his brains out in the cabin of his flagship in Naples Harbor. The stress had unhinged him, and the suicide note that he left for his wife and his 4 children is haunting. Part of it read, "What am I doing to you, my wife and dear children? I'm sick, so sick." We've last seen Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, a fine armor officer who happened to be George Patton's son-in-law, being hustled off to a German prison camp after his capture on the first morning of the Kasserine Pass debacle in Tunisia in February of 1943. In The Guns That Last Light, we are reunited with Colonel Waters in March 1945 as a consequence of Patton's harebrained scheme to launch a raid on the prison camp at Hammelburg in northern Bavaria, during which Waters was shot and severely wounded. I was given Colonel Waters' diary and the logs that he kept during 2 years in prison, and he kept a meticulous chart of daily prison rations, showing that the daily allotments typically included, for example, 35.7 grams of meat per man. That's just over an ounce. Plus 318 grams of barley bread, 200 grams of cabbage, and 143 grams of cow turnips. Waters carefully peeled the food labels off Red Cross relief package cans and pasted them into his log as if to extract a few final calories of nourishment from the memory. Labels of Topo peanut butter and Kroger fruitcake. I mentioned that the United States had a population of 130 million during World War II. We managed to put 16,112,566 people into uniform. Of those, there are about 1.3 million still alive, my father among them. They're leaving us at the rate of 300,000 a year, or about 800 a day. The number of surviving American veterans will slip below 1 million late next year, And the decade after that, in 2024, the number will dwindle to below 100,000. In 2036, the last year for which projections have been made by government demographers, the generation of Americans that fought and helped win the most destructive war in human history will be fewer than 400 still alive, less than half the size of an infantry battalion. This country suffered less than any of the other major combatants. We emerged with our industrial base not only intact, but thriving, with 2/3 of the world's gold supply, with plentiful energy, with optimism and a sense of promise. But about 400,000 Americans died during the war, and 291,000 of those were killed in battle. Nearly half of those battle deaths occurred in Western Europe during the last 11 months of the war. In 1947, the next of kin of all American soldiers who were left overseas, and that amounted to virtually everyone who had died in the Pacific or in Europe and whose bodies had been recovered, those next of kin were issued Quartermaster Form 345. And they were given a one-time option, a choice, whether to bring their son or daughter home or whether to leave them buried overseas in one of 24 American battle monuments, cemeteries with their comrades. About 4 in 10 chose to leave their soldier overseas. 6 in 10 brought them home at a cost of $564.50 per dead soldier, something only a rich, victorious country could afford. Every grave, whether of a soldier who was going to remain overseas or come home, was opened by hand, and the remains of every dead soldier dusted with an embalming compound of formaldehyde, aluminum chloride, wood powder, clay, and talc. They were then placed in a metal casket with a satin pillow. Labor strikes in the United States caused a shortage of casket steel, and there was also a shortage of licensed embalmers. So in warehouses in Cherbourg and Cardiff and elsewhere, the dead accumulated. They stacked up. Finally, the SS Joseph V. Connolly, which was the first of 21 ghost ships from Europe and the Pacific, sailed from Antwerp with 5,000 soldiers in her hold. On October 27, 1947, the Connolly berthed in New York, and stevedores winched the caskets from the ship 2 at a time in specially made slings, and a great diaspora began as the dead and those that followed traveled, mostly by rail, across the Republic for burial in their hometowns or national cemeteries. That's how the dead came home. But what of their belongings? What of the things they carried? Even before the dead came home, those things had been coming home. At a large warehouse on Hardesty Avenue in Kansas City, the U.S. Army Effects Bureau, part of the Quartermaster Corps, had begun as a modest enterprise with a half-dozen employees in February 1942. That expanded to more than 1,000 employees, and by August 1945, they were handling 60,000 shipments a month, each laden with the effects of dead Americans from 6 continents. Hour after hour, day after day, shipping containers were unloaded from rail freight cars on a siding next to the warehouse and then hoisted by elevator to the depot's 10th floor. And here the containers traveled by assembly line on a conveyor belt from station to station down to the 7th floor as inspectors pawed through the crates to extract pornography, ammunition, perhaps letters, amorous letters from a girlfriend you didn't want a grieving widow to see. Workers used grinding stones and dentist drills to remove corrosion and blood from helmets and web gear. Laundresses took pains to scrub bloodstains out of uniforms. A detailed inventory was pinned to each repacked container before it was stacked in a storage bin. And all the while, banks of typists in a huge adjacent room were banging out letters, 70,000 letters a month by the summer of 1945. And the gist of those letters was, "Dear sir, dear madam, we have your dead son's stuff. Where shall we send it?" Over the years, Effects Bureau inspectors found tapestries, enemy swords, a German machine gun, an Italian accordion, walrus tusks, a shrunken head, a tobacco sack full of diamonds, among thousands of diaries also collected in Kansas City was a small notebook that had belonged to Lieutenant Herschel G. Horton, who was 29 years old. He was from Aurora, Illinois, and he had been shot in the right leg and hip during a firefight with the Japanese in New Guinea. And Horton had dragged himself into a grass shanty, and over the several days that it took for him to die, he wrote a final letter in the notebook. It began, "My dear, sweet father, mother, and sister, I lay here in this terrible place, wondering not why God has forsaken me, but why he is making me suffer. Our current poet laureate, Natasha Trethewey, ends her poem Pilgrimage, which is about a visit to Vicksburg, with these lines. In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm. My ambition is for you too to feel that heavy arm, to feel the palpable presence of those who risked everything and in some instances gave everything for us. Thank you very much. Oh, sure, I have opinions about the way the war was fought in Europe. There was an enormous controversy that went on for a long time over how best the Allied forces should best move across Western Europe. And the gist of the argument was whether or not to concentrate American and British forces primarily, although there were others also, including Poles and other nationalities in that fighting force, into a single, relatively narrow front, or, and that argument was best articulated by Field Marshal Montgomery, or to attack on a broader front, particularly with two ostensibly complementary thrusts. And that argument was made most vigorously by Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the senior commander, so Eisenhower ultimately had the last say on it. That argument over that controversy has been going on for 70 years. I'm not going to resolve it tonight, other than to point out that ultimately Eisenhower did what he set out to do, which was to defeat the Wehrmacht, to encircle the Ruhr, which is the main industrial region of Germany, and to force the Germans to fight for the Ruhr or be obliterated, which is basically what happened. Now, tacitly within that question is the issue of whether or not when one German unit fought an American unit, one battalion against a battalion, one regiment against a regiment, the Germans tended to be tactically superior. Max Hastings makes this argument frequently. My counter-argument is that's nonsense. It's not about tactics. It's a global war, and global wars are about systems. Which system can generate the tremendous logistical and transportation needs for a global war? Which system can design, build, transport, and detonate an atomic bomb? The Germans were incapable of crossing the English Channel, which at its narrowest is 21 miles wide in order to invade Great Britain. The United States projected power into the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Southeast Asia, the Mediterranean. So to me, the argument of whether or not the Germans, who clearly had a tactical genius, were superior when it came to mano-a-mano knife fights is beside the point.
I wonder if you could comment on Operation Tiger in the spring of 1944 and the apparent decision, at least in America, to keep that secret for so long and not to notify the next of kin of their involvement in it.
Sure. Operation Tiger occurred, as she said, in the spring of 1944. There was an exercise that was underway. This is a couple of months before the invasion of Normandy. And this is off the southern coast of England. And there was a convoy that was transporting men who eventually were to be used in the invasion. And they were rehearsing, basically, and they were going to do a landing in Devon. And there was improper protection for the convoy. And German motor torpedo boats, basically, got inside the convoy and fired torpedoes and sank a couple of the ships. There were 7, nobody knows exactly how many died, probably 700 or 800. There were bodies washing up on the southern coast of England for weeks. Yeah, it was kept secret. And it was kept secret because you didn't want the Germans to know how badly you had been hurt. And secondarily, you didn't want the folks at home to know how badly you'd screwed up. And it was a screw-up, there's no doubt about it. There have subsequently been allegations of nefarious cover-ups and so on since then that are not true. They suppressed the truth at the time, as they did with so many things. There was very strict censorship at the time on virtually everything. But Operation Tiger was revealed that summer, the summer of '44. So, you know, you have to say that it was partly a British fault. They were supposed to provide protection for the convoy. And through just a series of slip-ups and goof-ups that happen in war, the proper protection wasn't provided. It was a catastrophe. It was awful. It's worth all of us remembering that before the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, Dwight Eisenhower, as he had done before previous invasions, wrote a note, famously, taking full responsibility. He wrote a note saying, the invasions have failed. I made the decision to pull the troops that were trying to land on the beaches off the beaches. If any blame adheres, it must adhere to me. It's a real testament to his character. You read that note. By the way, he misdated it by a month. It shows how exhausted and stressed he was at the time. What would have happened? It's counterfactual, but what would have happened? There was some vague thinking about this will probably set us back a year. Obviously, troop losses couldn't be projected, but they would have been severe if it had been bad enough to abort the landings. More important, actually, than the troops for Eisenhower, and Operation Tiger was of great anxiety to him for this reason, and that was it meant they would have lost a lot of landing craft, and particularly the big landing ships like LSTs, landing ship tanks. As it was, there was a very, very narrow margin. There were just enough of those around to transport what you needed to transport for the initial landings and the reinforcement of the beaches thereafter. And it's not so much being able to get onto Omaha or Gold or Juneau, it's to be able to stay there and to reinforce and to build the bridgehead. And you're trying to get deep enough in, hopefully in the first 24 hours, so that you push German artillery far enough away from the beaches so they can't range you on the beaches with their artillery. That's the first order of business. And after that, other things fall into place. If they hadn't been able to do that, and it was dicey at Omaha, if they hadn't been able to do that, well, my belief is they would have gone back to the drawing board and would have come up with another plan to land perhaps somewhere else other than Normandy. Normandy, of course, was a surprise to the Germans. They were generally expecting the invasion to be at the Pas de Calais, which is the nearest point in France from England. But it would have been not only a physical setback and a tragedy, it would have been so morally upsetting it's hard to imagine. Yes, ma'am.
My late parents' generation and all of their friends, both American and
Can you hear her in the back? Speak louder, please.
I'm sorry. My late parents' generation, both American and European, their lives as I was growing up, they were always very much defined, sometimes very much damaged, in a rare few cases actually illuminated by the Second World War. And it was always referred to as the war. My father served in Korea. Korea was Korea. The Second World War was the war. And there was a sense of essentially nobility attached to that war. As a journalist who's also written about our current wars, there seems to be a real disconnect, a divorce from, an ignorance about, and in some cases just a sense of impotence. How do you see the military going forth from here, from being our protectors? I mean, we still have troops who die every day, who give their lives. How do we go forth from here?
Well, we go forth the way we've gone forth since 1775. We go forth. That I think is not, that's not something I lose sleep about. I think implicit in your question is the distinction between then and now. And there is a distinction in the sense that we talked about 130 million people, 16.1 million in uniform versus today, 313 million of us, about 2 million in uniform if you count the Guard and Reserve. Then everybody's got skin in the game. Everybody has someone they love in harm's way. Today, if you got skin in the game, you're unusual. So I think that that is a real distinction between then and now. And I think it's something that we don't really come to grips with as a country in 2013. You know, the military today, it's obviously much smaller. You had an army of 8.1 million in 1944. Today, they're struggling to scratch out 500,000. But the military in some ways today is really much more capable than that military. The soldiers are more fit, they're more educated, they're better trained, I think they're better led, frankly. It's a very good force. Now, it's a force that's beat up and tired and worn down, and they've been fighting for a long time now. And that's something we do have skin in the game. Whether you've got a loved one in harm's way in Afghanistan or not, you got skin in the game here. And it's important to know that. And not just to clap when you're at a Nationals game and they introduce those guys in the 5th inning. That's not what it's about. That's not what citizenship is about. And so I'm more concerned about that than I am about how the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine will get along. They'll get along. But I'm more concerned about the relationship of the Republic to its armed forces.
So my question is, do you know how many German POWs and repatriatees died after the war was over?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I do know that in some cases they were treated disgracefully. And it happened even before the war was over. There were murders at some of the camps, Dachau being the preeminent example, where American soldiers went on a rampage, walking into Dachau and seeing Dachau, and there were SS guards who had surrendered and were gunned down or beaten to death. And it was done in part by outraged surviving inmates, but it was also done by American soldiers from the 2 divisions that took part in the liberation. And that was not the only time that there were atrocities at the camps, and there were many, many occasions of killing prisoners. So that happened even before the war ended. And the treatment of prisoners, partly because there were so many of them. We, meaning the Americans in particular, and the British also, were unprepared to feed millions at a time when you've got many millions on the move, refugees shifting around Europe. It was a nightmare. So there was...
The Germans faced somewhat of a nightmare feeding the folks in the concentration camps, did they not?
I wouldn't disagree with that. Thanks a lot.
Rick, I hope you won't mind a question about how you research and write. In reading the first two books of the trilogy, just dazzled over and over by how you bring the story to life by bringing us into people's neighborhoods and in their lives. And I've seen you talk before about your passion for outlining. You'll spend months on an outline and then start to fill in the facts. I have this image of a wall filled with Post-it notes, and I sense that that's not how you do it. But just curious about the tools you use, and then as you start to weave in the facts from your research, how do you keep track of it all?
Well, this crowd really wants to hear about my outlining techniques.
Sorry.
Well, at the heart of your question is really how do you distinguish between this that you use and this that you don't use? And I'm always looking for fine brushstrokes that bring something or someone to life. Keats once said, "A fact is not a truth until you love it." Oft quoted by Shelby Foote, who wrote a trilogy about the Civil War. A fact is not a truth until you love it. And so somebody like me and narrative writers, we're looking for facts to love, to tease coherence and intimacy from the past. And that is part of what the researching art is about. And it is an art form, I think. When I basically, as Brad said, I'm pretty regimented about how I'm going to do this, and I have timetables, and I think working in the newspaper business gave us an appreciation for deadlines. I was an editor, so I really appreciated deadlines for part of my working life. And the outlining process, I use the outlining software in Word. I think it is the greatest invention since the plow. It's fantastic. And one of our old colleagues, Bart Gelman, showed me how to use it once years ago, and it's just a great way for organizing an enormous amount of material. And for me, it works not only as a roadmap to show me where I'm going to go in this big book, but it also tells me where everything is in my notes. And I will spend months, I think 7 or 8 months on this book doing the outline, and the outline, this is not a short book, and the outline was 3 times longer than the book. So it's a very important part of the process for me. But once I've got it done, and it's incredibly tedious, I just want to, hang myself or come down here and bother Brad. But once I'm done, I do have a map. I know where I'm going. I've got a sense. I know where things are, which is pretty critical. And I have a sense of how this is going to play out. I mean, in 1938, this is the year before the war starts, right? In terms of combat power and combat readiness, the United States ranked 17th in the world, right behind that perennial military powerhouse, Romania. And so what you see in the 2 years, essentially, that the war is underway, in which we are not an overt participant, is us getting ready because we are so unready. And that is required, I think, for us to have the kind of impact that ultimately we do. Now, during that period of time, not only are we training an Army, Navy, and Army Air Forces of 16 million, but we're also building an industrial base that will outfit not only Americans but our allies and provide a large portion of the beans, bacon, bombs, and all the rest of it for the Brits and the Soviets and the French. Almost everything the French had when they came into the war big time in 44 and 45 came from us. So my feeling is that had we somehow blundered into it earlier, first of all, the American people, as you well know, were absolutely ununified over what to do. And it took Pearl Harbor and it took an act of aggression by our eventual allies to unify the country. The country was not ready to fight a global war, either physically or mentally. And so my feeling is that had Roosevelt somehow finessed us into the war, that our impact would have not have been particularly substantial. You know, I mean, you can spin out the counterfactuals forever, obviously,
sure.
But Hitler had decided fairly early that he had a plan, and it didn't involve standing down. Now, we could have complicated it perhaps in some ways, but I don't believe that we were in a position to influence what Hitler ultimately determined to do. Beyond that, it's hard from, you know, I deal with what happened, not with what might have happened.
Sure. No, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.